For years, Drake and Kendrick Lamar stood at the top of hip-hop like two immovable forces. Different styles, different philosophies, different paths to power. One ruled the charts, the other ruled respect, and fans argued endlessly about who was really winning. But then, something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. There was no explosive diss track flooding the internet overnight. Instead, it was quiet, calculated, almost invisible at first. And that's why it worked. While everyone was watching Drake dominate numbers, Kendrick was playing a completely different game. No rush, no panic, no desperate responses. Just patience, timing, precision. Then Kendrick made his move. Not the kind of move that trends for 1 week. The kind that rewrites the conversation. Suddenly, the energy shifted. Drake kept moving forward, but the momentum wasn't there anymore. The culture stopped reacting the same way. The praise felt forced. The confidence looked rehearsed. And for the first time, people started asking a dangerous question. Did Drake just lose something he can't get back? Because in hip-hop, losing a battle doesn't always mean losing with a diss. Sometimes it means losing control of the narrative, losing credibility, losing silence, when silence starts sounding loud. Kendrick didn't chase Drake. He didn't compete on Drake's terms. He didn't try to outstream him. He waited and let the moment collapse on its own. That's what makes this so uncomfortable to watch. There was no comeback moment, no clear counterattack, just a slow realization that the game had changed, and Drake wasn't setting the rules anymore. This isn't about who sold more records. This isn't about who has more hits. This is about power, about influence, about who controls the culture when the noise fades. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because after what Kendrick did, Drake didn't fall. He just couldn't recover. Nobody announces the moment power changes. There's no headline for it, no breaking news alert, no countdown. It just happens. For years, Drake and Kendrick Lamar existed at the top of hip-hop like two opposing forces that could never collide in the same way. Drake was everywhere, dominating charts, breaking records, shaping mainstream sound. Kendrick, on the other hand, moved differently. Rare appearances, intentional silence, albums that felt more like statements than products. Fans argued constantly about who was winning, but the truth was simpler. They weren't playing the same game. Drake's power came from visibility, from presence, from being unavoidable. Kendrick's power came from restraint, from knowing when not to speak. And that difference is where everything started to change. At first, no one noticed it, because nothing dramatic happened. No diss track shook the internet. No explosive interview went viral. No direct confrontation forced sides to be chosen. Instead, the shift was subtle. Drake kept doing what Drake does, releasing music, staying active, remaining in the spotlight. But the reactions weren't hitting the same way anymore. The excitement felt routine. The praise felt automatic. Something was missing, even if people couldn't explain what it was. Meanwhile, Kendrick stayed quiet. Too quiet. And in hip-hop, silence is never empty. Silence is pressure. When Kendrick disappeared, people didn't move on. They waited. And waiting creates expectation. Expectation creates weight. And weight changes how every move is judged. That's when the narrative started slipping. Not loudly, but slowly. Because hip-hop isn't just about music. It's about who the culture trusts. And trust doesn't come from being everywhere. It comes from being selective. Kendrick never chased the spotlight. He let it come to him. And over time, that made his presence feel heavier than Drake's constant visibility. This wasn't a battle of skill. It was a battle of positioning. Drake stayed in motion. Kendrick stayed in control. And control is dangerous. When Kendrick finally reappeared, even briefly, the reaction was different. It wasn't excitement. It was attention. People listened harder, read deeper, replayed lines, asked questions. Drake's releases came and went. Kendrick's moments lingered. That's when people began to sense it. Something had flipped, not in numbers, not in sales, but in authority. Because in hip-hop, authority isn't measured by charts alone. It's measured by who defines the conversation when things get quiet. And Kendrick was defining it without even trying. Drake still had hits, still had influence, still had reach. But reach isn't the same as impact, and the culture was starting to separate the two. Slowly, Drake's dominance began to feel reactive, like he had to stay visible to maintain relevance. Kendrick didn't need to prove anything. His absence became part of his power. That's when the pressure shifted. Every move Drake made was analyzed. Every silence from Kendrick was respected. And respect is the one thing you can't manufacture. Hip-hop fans started asking questions they never asked before. Why does Kendrick feel bigger without doing more? Why does Drake feel louder but less threatening? Why does one artist move the culture by speaking, while the other moves it by waiting? These weren't debates anymore. They were realizations. Because Kendrick wasn't competing with Drake directly. He was outgrowing the space Drake was operating in. And once that happens, there's no diss track that fixes it. No hit single that erases it. No moment that suddenly flips it back. That's the scary part. Drake didn't lose a battle. He didn't lose a feud. He began losing leverage. And leverage, once gone, doesn't come back easily. By the time people realized what Kendrick had done, it was already over. Not officially, not publicly, but culturally. And that's where this story really begins. Silence only works when people are listening. And by the time Kendrick Lamar stopped speaking, the entire culture was leaning in. That's what made this phase different. Kendrick didn't disappear because he had nothing to say. He disappeared because he didn't need to say it yet. Every gap between his moves became space for speculation. Every unanswered moment turned into tension. Drake couldn't afford that luxury. He stayed active, present, consistent, and on the surface, that looked like strength. New releases, new features, new headlines. The machine kept running, but the machine was making noise, not impact. That's when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. In hip-hop, silence can either signal weakness or confidence. And Kendrick's silence didn't feel empty. It felt intentional. Meanwhile, Drake's constant presence started feeling defensive, even when it wasn't meant to be. The culture noticed the difference. Drake spoke often. Kendrick spoke rarely. Drake reacted. Kendrick waited. And waiting changes the rules. Because once an artist controls timing, they control meaning. Every time Drake dropped something, it entered a crowded conversation. Every time Kendrick did anything, a verse, a feature, a brief appearance, it became Fans didn't just listen to Kendrick. They decoded him. Lyrics weren't consumed. They were examined. Silence wasn't ignored. It was interpreted. Drake's work still reached millions, but the response had changed. People heard it, moved on, and waited for the next drop. Kendrick's moments lingered, even when there were fewer of them. This wasn't about talent. Both artists had already proven that. This was about who the culture trusted to move it forward. And trust doesn't grow from repetition. It grows from intention. At some point, Drake started sounding like he was chasing relevance rather than defining it. Not because his music was bad, but because the landscape had shifted. The culture wanted meaning, not just momentum. Kendrick gave them that, without oversharing, without explaining himself, without asking permission. That's when the pressure flipped completely. Now, every Drake release was measured against an absence. Every move was judged in comparison to something Kendrick hadn't even done yet. That's a losing position for anyone, because you can't compete with mystery. The more Drake spoke, the more the audience wanted Kendrick. The less Kendrick appeared, the heavier his presence felt. And slowly, the narrative hardened. Drake still had the numbers. Kendrick had the authority. And authority is what decides legacy. This is the point where artists usually respond aggressively, where they try to take control back, where they flood the space with sound and statements. But Kendrick didn't move, and Drake didn't know how to attack something that wasn't there. There was no target, no obvious angle, no moment to flip, just a growing sense that the balance of power had changed, and there was no clean way to reverse it. This is where recovery becomes impossible, not because of one mistake, but because of momentum going the wrong direction. Hip-hop history is full of moments like this, where one artist doesn't fall, but fade from dominance as the culture's attention quietly relocates. Drake wasn't losing fans. He was losing control of the moment. And Kendrick had already moved past the moment entirely. That's the part most people missed. Kendrick wasn't trying to defeat Drake. He was positioning himself beyond the rivalry. Above it. By the time people started asking if Drake should respond, the question itself was outdated. Because Kendrick wasn't waiting for a response. He had already shifted the conversation somewhere else. And once the culture follows someone forward, it rarely turns back. By the end of this phase, the damage wasn't dramatic. It was structural, invisible to headlines, but obvious to anyone paying attention. Drake didn't collapse. He stalled. And in hip-hop, stalling is often worse than losing. Because momentum never waits. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. Quietly. Gradually. So slowly that by the time you realize it's gone, there's nothing left to recover. That's what made this moment so dangerous for Drake. There was no single failure. No public defeat. No obvious mistake the way history usually records them. Just a slow loss of control. Because control in hip-hop isn't about who drops the most music. It's about who sets the direction everyone else follows. And by this point, Kendrick Lamar was already moving in a different direction entirely. The culture wasn't waiting for Drake anymore. It was waiting for meaning. Drake's releases still made noise. They still dominated playlists. But noise fades. Meaning lingers. And Kendrick had quietly positioned himself as the artist people looked to when they wanted something deeper than momentum. That's when it became clear. Drake was still playing the game he had mastered, but the game had changed. Hip-hop had grown more reflective, more critical, more aware of intent. Listeners wanted substance, purpose, and authenticity that felt earned, not manufactured. Kendrick understood that shift early. He didn't adjust his strategy, he anticipated it. While Drake stayed in constant motion, Kendrick created distance. Not from the audience, but from the competition. He made himself harder to compare, harder to categorize, harder to challenge. And that's when comparison stopped working in Drake's favor. Because you can't outpace someone who isn't racing you. You can't dominate a space someone has already outgrown. The rivalry stopped being direct. It became symbolic. Drake represented continuity. The system that worked, the formula that succeeded. Kendrick represented evolution, the uncomfortable push forward that doesn't care about comfort or familiarity. And hip-hop has always followed evolution. By now, fans weren't asking who was better. They were asking who mattered more right now. And that's a brutal question, because relevance isn't about presence. It's about necessity. Drake was present. Kendrick was necessary. That distinction changes everything. This is where recovery becomes impossible. Not because Drake lacked talent or vision, but because he was locked into an identity that no longer defined the future. Reinvention is hardest when success has already proven your old approach works. Kendrick didn't have that problem. He never needed to protect an image. He let the work speak, then stepped away. That freedom gave him leverage Drake didn't have. Every Kendrick appearance felt intentional. Every Drake appearance felt expected. An expectation kills mystique. By the time Drake could have shifted course, the culture had already adjusted its focus. Kendrick wasn't reacting to trends. He was setting emotional benchmarks. People didn't just listen, they reflected. That's not something you respond to with a hit record. That's something you either embody or you don't. The point of no return isn't dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't come with an announcement. It happens when the audience stops demanding answers from one artist and starts demanding direction from another. And that's exactly what happened. Drake didn't fall from the top. The top moved. And Kendrick moved with it. By the end of this shift, Drake wasn't defeated, but he was displaced. Still powerful. Still successful. Still relevant. Just no longer defining the moment. And once that happens, recovery isn't about fighting back. It's about accepting a new position in the culture. Kendrick didn't take Drake's crown. He made crowns irrelevant. That's the hardest loss to process, because there's nothing to reclaim, only something to accept. And in hip-hop, acceptance is rarely where legends are made. It's where eras end. Every era ends the same way. Not with noise, not with an announcement, but with a quiet agreement the culture never officially signs. At this point, the conversation wasn't about battles anymore. It wasn't even about rivalry. It had become something much bigger, something more permanent. Legacy. Drake and Kendrick Lamar had reached a place where wins and losses stopped mattering. What mattered now was what each of them would leave behind. And that's where the distance between them became undeniable. Drake's legacy was already clear. Consistency, longevity, global reach. He mastered the modern system of music in a way few artists ever have. He understood timing, audience, and accessibility better than almost anyone in his generation. That matters. But Kendrick's legacy was forming different. It was about definition. Kendrick didn't just exist within hip-hop. He reshaped how hip-hop measured importance. He blurred the line between rapper and narrator, artist and commentator, music and message. And that difference changed how people judged success. At some point, the culture stopped asking, who's bigger? They started asking, who will still matter when this moment is over? That question favors artists who build meaning, not momentum. Drake's catalog represented moments, summers, hits, emotions tied to specific times in people's lives. Kendrick's catalog represented chapters, reflections that aged, deepened, and demanded revisiting. Neither approach was wrong, but only one of them aged into authority. Legacy isn't decided by popularity in the present. It's decided by relevance in the future. And Kendrick had positioned himself as an artist whose work would be studied, not just remembered. That's when the verdict quietly formed. Drake was the soundtrack of an era. Kendrick became the voice of it. And voices outlast soundtracks. This didn't mean Drake failed. Far from it. His impact was undeniable, his influence permanent. But influence and legacy aren't the same thing. Influence fades as styles change. Legacy adapts. Kendrick built his work to survive reinterpretation. Drake built his to dominate the moment. Only one of those strategies guarantees permanence. By now, younger artists weren't trying to copy Drake's formula. They were trying to capture Kendrick's depth. They didn't ask how to chart longer. They asked how to say something that lasts. That's the final shift. When the next generation stops chasing your success and starts chasing someone else's meaning, the crown has already moved. And Kendrick never had to take it. He let time do the work. This is the part people misunderstand. Kendrick didn't win because he outperformed Drake. He won because he outweighted him. He trusted that substance would outlive speed, that patience would outlast presence. And history usually rewards that bet. Drake will always be remembered as one of the most successful artists of his time. Kendrick will be remembered as one of the most important. There's a difference. Success is admired. Importance is referenced. Years from now, people won't argue about who had more hits. They'll ask whose work explained the moment better, whose music still feels necessary when the context fades. And that's where the story settles. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in definition. Drake defined an era's sound. Kendrick defined its conscience. And once an artist becomes the conscience of a culture, there's no competition left. Only reflection. That's why this didn't end with a response. That's why there was no comeback moment. Because Kendrick didn't end Drake's career. He ended the comparison. And when comparisons stop, the verdict is already in. Every story reaches a moment where there's nothing left to argue. No sides to take. No points to prove. No winner to crown. Only perspective. By the time the dust settled, it became clear that this was never really about Kendrick Lamar versus Drake. That framing was convenient, dramatic, and clickable, but incomplete. This was about two different ideas of success colliding with time. Drake built his legacy by mastering the present. He understood how to stay relevant, how to stay heard, how to remain emotionally connected to millions of listeners across years and trends. His music moved fast because the world was moving fast. And for a long time, that made him unstoppable. But time doesn't reward speed forever. Eventually, the culture slows down. It reflects. It asks harder questions. And when that happens, the rules change. Kendrick Lamar was never racing the clock. He was preparing for the moment when the clock stopped mattering. That's the difference most people miss. Kendrick didn't wait because he was unsure. He waited because he knew timing would do more damage than confrontation ever could. He trusted that meaning would outlast momentum. And he was right. When the noise faded, Kendrick's work didn't disappear. It became clearer. Drake's music captured how people felt in the moment. Kendrick's music captured why they felt that way. One documented emotion, the other documented cause. And causes age better than feelings. This doesn't make one artist good and the other bad. It makes them different, permanently. Drake's strength was connection. Kendrick's strength was clarity. One gave people something to feel. The other gave them something to understand. History remembers understanding. That's why, years from now, this won't be discussed as a rivalry. It will be discussed as a crossroads. A moment when hip-hop quietly decided what it valued more going forward. Not louder voices, not faster output, but intention. Kendrick didn't dominate the culture by force. He let the culture arrive at him on its own terms. And when it did, the comparison ended naturally. Because comparisons only exist when two people are chasing the same thing. By the end, they weren't. Drake continued to succeed. Kendrick continued to matter. And those paths stopped intersecting. That's the real ending. Not defeat, not victory, but divergence. When future artists study this era, they won't ask who responded better or who dropped more hits. They'll ask how one artist stayed visible and how another became inevitable. Visibility fades. Inevitability doesn't. Kendrick didn't silence Drake. He made silence meaningful again. And once silence carries weight, noise has to work harder to be heard. That's the lesson hidden inside this story. The culture didn't turn against Drake. It simply turned inward. It wanted depth. It wanted purpose. It wanted art that didn't chase attention, but deserved it. Kendrick Lamar understood that before anyone else did. And by the time everyone caught up, the conversation was already over. Not because Kendrick won, but because he no longer needed to. When the noise fades, what remains is what mattered all along. And that's where this story truly ends. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. This channel isn't about chasing noise or reacting to headlines. It's about understanding what really moves the culture when the hype fades. If you value depth over drama, meaning over momentum, and stories that actually last, you're in the right place. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this. Not rushed takes, not recycled opinions. Real conversations about music, power, and legacy. If you agree with this perspective, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this kind of content deserves to be seen. And if you disagree, leave a comment. The best discussions happen when different viewpoints collide. New videos drop regularly, and each one builds on the last. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you in the next one.